Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we watch horror films and read horror books. This is Anna Bogacka, your podcast host. If this is your first time listening, we usually cover horror film history on the main feed and notable new horror releases over on the Final Girls Patreon. But alongside our film coverage, I'm doing a monthly series called Bloody Book Club, where I interview some of the most exciting people who are writing horror right now. And I'm very excited to be joined in this episode by Eliza Clark, one of the most exciting new voices in British fiction. After her Pitch Black debut Boy Parts went viral, Clark was named one of Granta's best young British novelists. Her second novel, Penance, came out last year and has just been released in paperback. And her collection of body horror short stories, She's Always Hungry, will come out later this year. In this chat, which we did record a little while ago, we mostly talk about Penance, an ambitious novel which takes the form of a true crime reconstruction of the horrific murder of a 16-year-old girl in a fictional seaside town called Crow-on-Sea. The novel is a riveting read and is ambitiously structured, told from the perspective of a journalist who attempts to construct what he claims is the definitive account of the murder and what led up to it. In an era of true crime overexposure, Penance both recreates and challenges the accepted narrative form of the genre. In this conversation, we talk about the process of writing the book, about useless research rabbit holes, the true crime content machine, and reading books so good it almost makes you want to quit writing altogether. I hope this conversation inspires you to pick up Eliza's book and discover her writing. With all of that said, please enjoy my conversation with author Eliza Clark.
Thousands Japanese horror movies because I have such a strong nostalgic attachment to them. Yeah, and kind of from there I sort of got more into more broadly extreme cinema. But yeah, I don't know if I do gravitate toward any particular kind of horror. I think I just like seeing stuff that's bold and interesting and different. And now I've said that, I love found footage. I love I will watch any shit found footage film. I think I love the fake documentary format.
Yes.
For it. So if you can give me a Mungo, Noroi, I think it's called, the Japanese one. It's called Noroi the Curse, stuff like that. I'm I'll eat that shit up.
Yeah, I love those. There's one particular one, the Poughkeepsie tapes.
I love the Poughkeepsie tapes.
It's both a found footage horror and a serial killer movie, and I remember it being kind of one of the ones I was yeah, this is the gnarliest. It's all true. It's the gnarliest horror film ever made, and you don't really see anything.
Yeah, but it's so scary. I love the Poughkeepsie tapes. I'm a huge fan of that. I think it's super, super disturbing. It's really good with the amount that it holds back, and oh man.
Yeah. And I kind of going from films to books, I remember kind of starting to see, I picked up your first book, Boy Parts, almost by accident in a bookshop, and then I started seeing it everywhere. It really felt like it was sort of blowing up a little bit. And I wonder, after that first experience with your first novel, did you feel a pressure or a different kind of pressure writing a follow-up?
Sort of. I guess I kind of felt I felt a bit of pressure in terms of quality, and I feel I don't think Boy Parts is a perfect book by any stretch of the imagination, but it seemed to connect with so many people, and so many people seem to like it so much that I suppose it was the audience expectation of doing something as good as that was. I kind of felt the pressure there. But in terms of doing something kind of similar, I always knew I wanted to do something very different, and that I was really conscious of being kind of I guess pigeonholed into doing this sort of first person point of view. I guess just basically doing something the same again. I really didn't want to do that. And I think that was my main concern, was that I wanted to do something different and ambitious. But I wanted to, but I was sort of worried I was going to go too different. I don't know, probably
Hmm.
not too ambitious though.
And why do you think Boy Parts connected with people in the way that it did?
Um, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I think the fact that it's sort of funny, uh, does a lot does a lot to do that to kind of does
Hmm.
a lot of work for easing a lot of the sort of more transgressive material in there.
Hmm.
I mean, obviously there are like far more transgressive books that are kicking around out there, but I think is almost like a bit of an entry level disturbing book. I think it's sort of I guess it sits in quite a good place where if you are into like gnarly horror stuff,
Mm.
there's enough in there for you. But if maybe that's not your bag, there's more stuff in there that you can kind of connect to. So yeah, I think it's in quite a good place where it can appeal to like quite a broad swathe of people, even though it is sort of kind of I don't know. It feels like initially it was quite niche and culty,
Mm.
and then a lot of people apparently seem to start reading it on TikTok, and then
Wow.
uh,
Once a book ends up on Book Talk, you know exactly what
yeah,
happens.
yeah,
And there
exactly.
is there is like this love for, and I'm quoting TikTok here, where I live for a big chunk of my nights. Like they love quote unquote unhinged female characters.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
a Tessa Moshfegh, Boy Parts, a certain Hunger have like really blown up through that
Mm.
platform.
Yes, hitting with the feral girl audience,
Yes,
the
exactly.
femcel audience.
And jumping in, it's interesting you mentioned that you wanted to do something different, more ambitious, and Penance definitely is very, very different in structure, in style, in scale to Boy Parts. And I wanted to ask you, I read somewhere, I'm not quite sure where I read this, I might be completely making it up, that it took you about 4 years to write this book. Is that true?
Yes, three, I think.
Three.
So I started it in late 2019.
Mm.
Three's probably a bit of a stretch, it's probably two and a half. Let's call it two and a half.
Okay.
I started writing it in sort of, well, yeah, like autumn of 2019.
Hmm.
And then I finished the first draft. I'll say that I wrote it in a really, really bitty way. So I wasn't like working on it continuously from like autumn of 2019. It was like I was kind of writing chunks of it and then leaving it alone for a really long period of time and then coming back to
Hmm.
it. Um, yeah, so I started writing it in autumn of 2019. I finished the first draft in it will have been about March of 2022. So yeah, good, like more or less 3 years. And then if you count editing, which you probably should as part of the writing process, we were editing it like all the way through 2022 as well. And it kind
Mm.
of was just sort of more or less done by kind of January sort of early on this year. So it took me a lot longer to write than Boy Parts.
Mm.
And there were periods where I changed the structure a lot. I deleted big chunks. I yeah, so it was a much more I felt like there was a big difficulty curve that I went up when I was
Mm.
writing Penance versus when I was doing Boy Parts.
And was there something that came to you first from Penance? Was it just, I mean, I have many questions. I'll try to condense them about the structure, which I think is just so ambitious and so intricate. But with the start of the book, was there any particular scene or moment or tone or character that came to you first?
The first thing I actually wrote was the stuff about the victim. The victim's called Joan Wilson for
Mhm.
people who haven't read the book who are listening.
Yeah.
It was the stuff with Joan's parents on meeting on holiday was for some reason that was the first thing that I wrote.
Okay.
Was this section where it was kind of like talking not even the bit where she's being interviewed, just the sort of recollection of the parents meeting on holiday, because I think initially I wasn't quite sure if I was going to use sort of fake true crime book structure in the
Mm.
journalist voice. I think originally I was probably thinking to do something a bit more prosy. This is like, I suppose it tells you how long I was kind of potentially working on it, and in that, like, I can't remember what my intention was when I wrote
Mhm.
the first joke that I did. Um, yeah, so that was the first bit that I wrote for some reason, and I don't know why that came first. I genuinely could not tell you.
I'm sure someone will write a think piece about why that was the first scene. But I do want to talk about the structure because it has this almost like Russian doll-esque structure. It's a nonfiction true crime book within a novel, and then the true crime book is a combination of narrative, of blog excerpts, of interviews, podcast transcripts. Kind of how did you land on that structure, and how did you keep all of that, you know, aligned in your head?
With great difficulty.
It's,
The that
I'm like, if you were using like a Notion board or a really elaborate Google document, also feel free to share.
Yeah, it's the sort of the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia Pepe Sylvia bit was pretty much how I felt for like all of writing this. I think it's interesting that you use that kind of Matryoshka doll analogy for it, because that is almost how it felt, where it's like I had
Mm,
the idea for the rough story, and then I kind of had some third person prosy bits, and then I decided to do the sort of true crime social history stuff, which meant I needed to make up a town and make up the sort of social history of the town.
mhm,
Uh and then it was like, originally this was sort of about mid 2020. I thought, right, so we're gonna have a little bit of this social history stuff. We're gonna have the journalist voice cutting in, but mostly between like long sort of 10 to 20,000 word chapters of the killers speaking. So like almost directly from their diary entries or letters. And then I wrote like, there are sort of four voices that kind of get that treatment, and the first two you get in the book are Angelica and Violet. And I wrote all of the Angelica stuff, and I began to think this is bollocks. And then I wrote it just in this sort of first person point of view monologue way. It was like, this
mhm.
is insane, this is completely unreadable. And then I started doing the Violet stuff like that, and I thought, what the fuck am I doing? Um, so I just stopped and deleted all of that. And then I kept some of that. So some
Mhm.
of that did end up being worked back into the book, in like much, much shorter and more condensed ways. And that was almost like how I was kind of, through writing those, I sort of worked out what had happened in the build up to the murder,
Mhm.
but I still had absolutely no idea what I was going to do with the other two voices that sort of come in with that. And then I was like, I fuck this. And then I put it down for like 6 months. And then I moved publishers. So
Uh-huh.
this was originally contracted to be with Influx Press, and we moved to Faber and Faber. And in order to go out on submission with this, I needed like a tidier opening for it.
Mhm.
So I sat down and I wrote that the opening, like the very, very first sort of opening scene of kind of like the aftermath of this attack, with the victim sort of dragging herself out of
Mhm.
this location that she's been effectively tortured at, and kind of like running up to a hotel to get help, where while the sort of killers are kind of driving around in someone's sister's stolen car. And then the first kind of, I sat down and properly wrote the first like social history of the town chapter, and I tidied up the interview bit with the victim's mother. So that was what kind of went out with. And then that felt a lot more like, okay, this is what I'm doing with the book. I'm doing interviews, and I'm doing social histories of the town,
Mhm.
and everything's going to have this kind of connection. And then I'm going to work back in those big bits that I deleted
Mhm.
through interview sections. And then I got to like so I did that, and then I had another break for it. I went back to it in sort of summer of 2021,
Mhm.
and I had like I sort of had this like bit of wobble about the voice of the narrator where I was just kind of like, God, this is just so like weird and pious and like I can't quite because I was trying to emulate like genuinely like good and earnest true crime writers and it
Mhm.
just wasn't quite like working and I sort of had that bubbling in my mind and I kind of went ahead and wrote pretty much the first half of the book. And then I sort of got stuck again and then I read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote
Yes.
and I just wanted to die because it's so good. And it was just kind of like I was just kind of like, cool, so I'm never gonna be able to achieve this kind of line level writing. I'm never gonna be able to do something this good. I might as well fuck this. What was the point?
I
Why am I even
absolutely love. I've been rereading a lot of Truman Capote last year. I go on these weird binges of kind of authors that I've read a bit of,
mm.
and like I love this reaction to Truman Capote because you're right. It's like you read one of his short stories and you're like, well, fuck this. Like I should just
Yeah.
stop.
Exactly. It's just like it's proper like it's real like well why don't I just kill myself stuff in a way that like I just so rarely have that reaction
Hmm.
to other writers.
Hmm.
Because I think it's like not a very useful reaction to have to work that you admire, but it's just like so good that
Hmm.
it like sent me west. And then I started reading like about Truman Capote and just basically his like very plastic relationship with the truth and
Yes.
how much of In Cold Blood was if not pure fabrication, then like
Hmm.
complete elaboration on his part. And I thought, well, this is what I'm doing with my narrator.
Hmm.
And then that stuff fell into place a lot more. And then it was kind of like I wrote more of the I kind of got into the stuff with the characters we meet later on, or rather the character whose point of view we meet later on, who are Jade and Dolly. And then because I was really, really struggling with the Dolly voice particularly,
Hmm.
and I just sort of didn't quite know what to do with her. And then I think once I'd sort of placed my narrator as somebody who was not necessarily telling the truth, it became a lot easier to tangle with her.
Hmm.
And then I kind of got to it was like it was due to be handed in March of 2022. And I was still at my day job at the time, and I managed to, they very, very generously gave me 4 weeks,
Hmm.
like a 4 week sabbatical so I could get the book finished. And then I wrote the rest of it. So it was a bit of a kind of like a, you know, that like, um, it's like that meme that's like a picture of two circles and it's like how to draw an owl. And it's like you draw the two circles and then you draw the rest of the fucking owl. And it's like I feel like I spent like 2 years drawing two circles, and then in 4 weeks I drew the rest of the fucking owl. So that was when all of the like prose stuff came in that bit, the sort
Hmm.
of third person point of view narrative bits where I was kind of like, let's see if this works. And then it was very much a like, oh, it works really well, actually. I'm so good at telly. Why didn't I do this so much earlier? I should have done this ages ago. And then it all kind of just fell into place a bit. So yes, I'm sorry that was such a long rambling answer, but it was like it was like a whole fucking thing.
I love it.
I was writing this.
I love the honesty. It genuinely makes me feel a lot better myself about my process. Where it's like just like, yeah, I'm gonna spend 3 to 6 months with meticulous research and beautiful spreadsheets and a whole separate notebook and all these la-di-da-di plans of what I'm gonna do, and then just
Mm.
lose your mind for 4 weeks, and then
Yeah,
you have a manuscript at the end.
yeah, I think part of it was, but what super didn't help is that I didn't have any of the like beautiful spreadsheets. I'm so disorganized with world building stuff that it was like part of the reason
Mm.
that I think I went so mad is that I was just kind of like walking around trying to remember details of a place that I had made up. So it was like constantly having to like backtrack in the manuscript to check people's names and then like
Mhm.
making stuff up, not taking note of it, forgetting about it, and then having to backtrack and like make note of it like weeks later. Like a lot of the editing I did myself because I tend
Mhm.
to they say that there are two types of writers, which is you're either a planner or a pantser, which is you either fly by the seat of your pants or you plan stuff really carefully. And I'm kind of like a really unhelpful mix of both, where I'll start doing stuff and then I'll stop and then I'll go back and
Hmm.
almost do like a continuity edit to make sure, and then stop and then plan based on that,
Hmm.
and then do another chunk and then go back and then kind of, so I was having to do a lot of stopping and going back and correcting stuff, just like I said, almost just for continuity
Hmm.
purposes, because I kept like changing details and changing stuff. And I won't even get into some of the weird granular research I did. Like there's a chapter where I talk for probably about like it'll be like about 2,000 words or something, like really not that much, about the like Viking that allegedly may or may not, according to local folklore, have founded the town that the book is
Yes.
set in. And I sat and I spent what, like 4 or 5 hours listening to the audiobook of the sagas of Ragnar Lothbrok, just to get like a sense of like the vibe of like just for the Viking vibes, to see if I could work any of it in. And it was such a waste of my time.
I was not expecting that.
It was by some distance like the stupidest piece of research I have ever done.
I
Um
mean, the way that you talk about it actually sounds to me very cinematic. Like in the best possible way. It is the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia meme. It's also like every single screenwriter or director, the way that they talk, these even the images of kind of production offices of, having these like these made up worlds that they have to figure out like the type of fabric that someone would use on a planet that has never existed and will never exist.
Mm.
Um, can you tell me a little bit more about kind of those rabbit holes of research that you went down for the book? Because there's the Viking vibes, there's all the teenage stuff, there's all the Tumblr stuff, there's all the true crime podcasts, there's the tulpas and the supernatural elements, there's a Slender Man of it all, there's the tone of voice of like a middle-aged crank journalist, there's all the Brexiteer stuff. What were all those little wells of research that you found yourself down?
Oh my God, there was so much. There is like for the sort of journalist voice, once I'd kind of clicked that he was a bit of a sort of hack and a liar, I'd
Mm-hmm.
listened to, like, it had been a couple of years prior to that, I'd listened to this podcast about the Fred and Rose West case that was
Mm-hmm.
done by a guy who was like a tabloid journalist who'd reported on the case at the time. And there were a couple of instances in the pod. So the Fred and Rose West case was like really, really badly compromised by the British press. Like the way that the press behaved around that case was like disgusting and like could have like blown the whole thing up.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were witness tampering, they were paying people off, and there were loads and loads of issues that were just created by the fucking awful Murdoch press in this country. And like this journalist being like, yeah, and there were these journalists that were doing this stuff, and it was like, but you did, was that not you? Like it was this weird like talking about like other journalists at the time who were
Mm-hmm.
behaving in dreadful doing all of this dreadful misconduct. And it's kind of like, I don't know if this guy did do anything like that, but it was just kind of like, all right, so we're not gonna accept any accountability at all for that, or like even acknowledge that we were working for some of those papers that were like paying off witnesses at the time.
Mm-hmm.
um and yeah, I just thought that was absolutely fascinating, that idea of being like, yes, I was there at the time, but I didn't do any of the bad stuff, or rather, I'm just going to talk around like the bad press stuff that
Mm-hmm.
happened. Um, I read a lot of true crime books for this, because I think in part just almost to kind of like get a sense of that structure and the voice that's being used by like, I think it was good to read good true crime before I sort of made bad true crime.
Mm-hmm.
So I read a lot of incredible books. There's probably my favorite was The People Who Eat Darkness by Richard Lloyd Parry,
Mm-hmm.
which is about a British woman who went missing and was murdered in Japan while she was working there in summer as a hostess. And that's an excellent book in terms of like it's got that really good mix of like kind of really, really humanizing the victim and really, really spending a lot of time with her family and um like some of her dad, the victim's father's behavior particularly was quite strange.
Hmm.
And Parry gives him like a really fair shake, and it's like an excellent character study of both of her parents in a lot of ways. And you also get like this fantastic social history of like nightlife in Japan and in the Roppongi district in Tokyo specifically. And it's just it's like really, really great stuff. And I've already mentioned In Cold Blood by Truman Capote and The Sleep of Reason, who's by a writer with quite a generic name, so you'll be able to find it just by looking that up, which is about the James Bulger case, and it gives you a lot of like stuff about Liverpool and the shopping centre that the boy was famously kind of abducted from. And yeah, it's just a really fantastic, really empathetic,
Hmm.
really like restrained piece of work. And I read all of Brian Master's stuff. I read
Hmm.
Gordon Burns' Happy Like Murderers. Yeah, just it was a lot of stuff in that regard. And then for podcasts, I used to kind of habitually listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, and
Hmm.
then the more research I did for the book, the more I began to struggle with them.
Hmm.
So there were some that I would listen to thinking they were quite tasteless and not really. I don't know, it's sort of weird, like listening to a podcast and not having that much affection for them, but knowing that every now and again they'll come out with a really good like series of episodes about some historic incident that
Hmm.
happened like a couple of hundred years ago, and thinking like, oh, this is like genuinely like really good storytelling and journalism. And then them doing something about like a British serial killer and doing like the accents and being like awful, and just thinking like I just like can't listen to these people anymore.
Yeah.
um, um, yeah, and then I kind of found that like the sort of more kind of quote unquote respectable true crime podcasts, I was like really going off as I was listening to them. And there was one that I listened to a few years ago that I like at the time I found it really strange, but while I was writing Penance, I kind of couldn't stop thinking about it,
Hmm.
which was it was called Broken Hearts, the series. And I kind of feel
Okay.
it's sort of like I'm not calling it out, but I think it's interesting to listen to, and that like the reporting itself is actually like really sensitive and really well done. But the issue is that it has these like awful clanger adverts coming in like every sort of
Mm.
15 minutes, where it's talking about this terrible, terrible case where it was a white gay couple
Mhm.
in the States adopted 4 or 5 black children and then used them for like photo ops for like some political and volunteer work they were doing, while so they were like really, really pushy of having them out at like protests and taking pictures of like their oldest son hugging a cop and stuff. And then while at home they were neglecting them awfully, and they were treating them just absolutely appallingly. Like
Mhm.
it's genuinely like horrible stuff to listen to. And then the case ends with the mothers killing themselves and the children. And I
Fuck.
won't kind of get into details of how, but it's a horrible, horrible case. But like every 15 minutes in this fucking podcast, I love quick toothbrushes. I every it's just like a really awkward pause where it'll have like
Yeah.
and he was banging on the neighbor's door and nobody came to help him. Do you have trouble with your oral hygiene? And it and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like
Mm.
this sort of brutal combination of like one of the most horrible things I'd ever heard about. And then the person who was telling me about the horrible things every 15 or 20 minutes telling me to buy a toothbrush. It was just so strange. And I think I did listen to some really good podcasts that were really useful. There is a uh I'm just gonna pause and quickly look it up.
Sure, sure, sure.
You know what? I might actually be better going to the acknowledgements of my own book for this. Because it's
I've
just, you
got
know
it.
what?
I've got it right in front of me. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, we'll see who gets there quicker.
Let's
Uh,
see. Uh, Monster Talk podcast, nighttime
it's
podcast.
the Nighttime podcast.
Got it.
That's the one that I want.
Yeah.
It was sorry, I'm just gonna see if I can get to the
The episode.
yeah, I've got it. I've
It's
got it. Right, I've got it.
yeah.
Um, sorry. Um, there was also a really great series that the Nighttime podcast did, which was
Mhm.
about Lindsay Suvanarath, who
Mhm.
was a Tumblr user who got sort of I think she sort of started as just kind of like an edgy girl and
Mhm.
then sort of devolved into being a Nazi girl kind of quickly and ended up planning she didn't end up doing anything and I don't think anybody was hurt in the end. But her and her boyfriend planned to shoot up a mall on Valentine's Day in Halifax in Canada.
Mhm.
Um, and that was a really interesting case to hear about because obviously, like when you kind of hear about these sort of massacres that have kind of like relation to the internet, it's usually men and they're usually baked into like image boards and
Mhm.
specific forums for well, specific like incel forums and
Mhm.
stuff.
Mhm.
And I just thought this was an interesting case of just like a young woman operating on like a normal social media website, and posting this increasingly like extreme and strange material, and not kind of in I don't know, just kind of almost being allowed to operate like that until she got into this really extreme place. And I think that was really useful for me to listen to.
Mhm.
Um, just in terms of like thinking about like the kind of stuff that can be just ignored from people posting publicly. I think a lot of it is from almost that kind of like irony posting, irony poison thing where like it's kind of really hard to tell when people are joking or not. And I say like joking in heavy quotes, because a lot of the stuff that is being joked about is not funny.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, in terms of kind of like the sort of tulpa stuff, I there's a fantastic documentary about the Slender Man stabbing,
Mhm.
which I don't know if you've seen.
I've seen several of them. Is it the one that came
Yeah.
out around the same time when the girls were being tried?
Yes, I think it'll be
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah.
And they spoke to like the families and stuff, and
Mhm.
I think it's very like it's very sensitive and it's very well done. And it doesn't try to kind of like I guess demonize the kind of material that the girls were reading, and
Mhm.
I think it's like really sensitive to their mental health as well, which is interesting. But it's sort of brought up this idea of like Slender Man as like a tulpa,
Mhm.
as like this kind of like thing that people had made up. And I think around this time I also saw The Empty Man for the first time,
Mhm.
which is a fantastic film, which was obviously really, really kind of underappreciated when it came out and has sort of gone on to have a bit of a kind of cult life, I think, which is
Mhm.
great. And yeah, I was kind of just desperately trying to like find more material about this idea of like stories taking on a life of their own, but like
Yeah.
from like a skeptic point of view,
Mhm.
because I do really like I like a supernatural podcast and I like a spooky story, but I find that I really struggle with them when they come at it from like a kind of non-skeptical point of view. I just sort of find them a bit like ridiculous and often kind of like there's just not an appropriate amount of like critical thinking
Mhm.
being attached in a lot of those cases. But there is a good podcast called Monster Talk, which
Mhm.
is sort of talking about cryptids and like weird stuff like that from a skeptical point of view.
Yeah.
And they have this great episode where they spoke to like I think he's like an expert in Tibetan mythology, and he's just basically and it's they're sort of talking about the Slender Man case, and he was basically like, right, so the Western idea that we have of tulpas is like completely fabricated and it's like this completely Western idea. You're not even saying the word tulpa, right? um, that's just not what it is. It's not even like close to what it is, and you're not
Hmm.
even using the word right. And I just thought that was so interesting of like people getting this huge attachment to this idea that they've completely exoticized and going from this sort of like that this kind of like very orientalist place of like attaching all of this sort of mythology and power to this idea that has been essentially made up by people being weird on Reddit and like has nothing to do with with the actual like Tibetan mythology stuff.
Hmm.
Um and yeah, that was like a really, really important thing for me to sort of have listened to because I think yeah, it was just kind of a I was able to kind of like think more about the sort of group madness aspect
Hmm.
of what happens when we're leading up to this murder. Yeah, so basically a lot of very long research rabbit holes. Um and I guess a lot of research. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it all sounds fascinating and kind of funny as well, which I was not
Mm.
expecting, as you answered. But I was wondering, kind of, you mentioned that you spend a lot of time engaging as part of the research process of engaging with true crime, both good and bad. And I was
Mm.
wondering, kind of, after having written effectively a true crime book of a crime that never happened in a city that you made up, how and all that research, how has your own relationship with the genre changed?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I just can't do true crime podcasts anymore.
Mm.
I thought I might be able to go back to them after I was done and there was a bit more space, but I kind of have no desire to go back to them. Um, I think like I was always I think like one of my sort of issues, I guess, with true crime stuff and the sort of place that it's in socially and culturally at the minute
Hmm.
is I really don't like the way that people kind of try and frame their interest in it as like virtuous
Mm.
or like it's anything other than a bit prurient and voyeuristic. And I think I feel like I've at least always been aware that my interest in it was prurient and voyeuristic. And I think it's kind of fine to engage in things like that because I don't know, I just think it's very human. You are just interested in
Hmm.
people are interested in death, people are interested in ways that they might personally die.
Hmm.
People are interested in ways that other people die, and people are interested in like extreme personalities and strange behavior. And there's this feeling that like I guess like something like this could kind of happen to anybody. Which I think is very like alluring and very interesting to almost kind of like play that out in your head, that scenario of like what would happen if I was murdered? What would happen if someone I know was murdered? What would happen if I was solving a case kind of thing. And I think it's that what would happen if I was solving a case question, which has become particularly dangerous in the last couple of years,
Yeah.
as we have more and more people taking up this kind of sleuthing role and
Hmm.
kind of injecting themselves into investigations. And I suppose that has kind of had in some cases, in very few cases, there have been positive outcomes with that when you think about the genealogy work that was done to catch the Golden State Killer,
Hmm.
which I also read I'll Be Gone in the Dark as part of the research for this, which is a fantastic book.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's just kind of like people who think like in the UK we had a woman called Nicola Bulley went missing and was found, but she was found dead, but she was missing for a few weeks. And you had like people who were like trying to like solve the case and
Yeah,
like
the internet sleuths.
yeah, and like posting about her and contacting her family and like trying to like engage with the press and the police with this and I, I don't know, it's just I think it's just really like grim and dodgy. However, I do think there is like a good place. There is definitely a place for the true crime book. I documentaries can kind of go either way, I think, as we've seen with the sort of spate of Netflix stuff. It's the same with dramas. I just don't think like we really need like fictionalized versions of true crimes, especially when you can just like kind of like I guess like I did. You can pull things from real crimes and make something fictional and not be in this position where you're like stuff with like the Netflix Jeffrey Dahmer series recently where
Yeah.
that's obviously been very controversial and quite rightly so for the lack of consultation from victims' families and then like not consulting those people and then choosing to like portray them and fictionalize them, I just think is so morally gross. And some of the kind of like trashy documentary stuff that's come out that is like, I mean like Tiger King. I know that it's not really like true crime, but I listened to a series, like a podcast series about Joe Exotic.
Mhm.
So a fun fact about me is that I'm actually I have known about Joe Exotic for ages. I knew about Joe Exotic before he was cool.
Oh,
So
again, I
um
was not expecting you to be a Joe Exotic truther.
yeah, I'm a massive Joe Exotic truther. So I was like I first found out about him through that Louis Theroux did a documentary about
He
exotic pet
did,
ownership,
yes.
and Joe Exotic is in that. And I came out of that feeling, wow, what an animal abusing piece of shit. And then I kind of have been like, it's like the kind of person that you just sort of low key keep an eye on
Mm-hmm.
over the years. And there was a podcast series called Over My Dead Body,
Hmm.
which covered Joe Exotic and his feud with Carol Baskin far more even-handedly than that documentary did. And it was like, so there was like they have this whole bit in the podcast where they go over the fact that Joe Exotic like pretended to have cancer for an extended period of time and like definitely like did an arson at some point. And I was kind of watching the documentary like, right, when are we going to get to the fake cancer and the arson? And
Mm.
they just don't mention it. And then they go really hard in on Carol Baskin, where if I remember correctly, this podcast does kind of go into the stuff with the husband disappearance, but they pretty much go to the conclusion like, well, if anybody's going to go missing, it's probably going to be a millionaire with a pilot's license. And then so it was like watching it was just like this like insane exercise and just like pretending a man isn't like the worst person on the planet. um, because he's kind of like wacky and fun and
Mm.
a heavily edited Joe Exotic, I guess, is more sympathetic than a slightly odd woman that runs a cat rescue sanctuary. But God, I can't even remember how I got onto that. I was talking about true crime being shit. But
I think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I suppose that I feel like in books because you're not kind of hamstrung by that like very splashy Netflixy
Mhm.
budgety. We've got to make something that's gonna get like a million views and X amount of streams and downloads. There is like a lot more place for just things to be quite staid and quite like quite like empathetic and patient and can really look at like the actual background that led to this crime. Like for me, I think true crimes are never like this kind of extreme crime that I kind of have made up in the book. But
Mhm.
when these things happen in real life, it's never really like about what one person has done or what has happened to one person that leads to an incident like this, which is so out of the norm of any kind of acceptable behavior. It's always kind of about like what happened to this community and what happened to this person's family and what happened to the place that they live in and how have these people kind of been let down by how has everybody involved been let down really
Mhm.
by the the I guess by kind of society more broadly. And I think there's just a lot more space for that kind of exploration in books than there is on major multi-million dollar streaming platforms.
And you certainly don't have to, it's one of my, I was always a big fan of true crime. Fan is a terrible word to use, but I was always
Yeah.
interested in it.
Yes, yeah.
So I always kept an eye on it. One of the things that, and it's only really been quite recent, and I want to say it was actually with the Dahmer series. I'm also a
Mm.
massive Ryan Murphy apologist, so this was a difficult time for me personally that Ryan Murphy made a glossy TV show about Jeffrey Dahmer, and I felt it felt too icky for me even to
Yeah.
fully watch. And the fact that there was a whole different Dahmer documentary dropped around the same time that the
Mm.
fiction show was released, I was like, now, and there's a new true crime doc every week on Netflix, literally every week. I'm
Yeah.
not keeping up with them anymore. And a lot of them are kind of the greatest hits of true crime. And that's maybe a conversation for another time. But one thing I do find interesting is kind of how in this moment, true crime has become an IP based business in the same way as the
Yes.
MCU is, right? Or in the same way
Yeah.
as like Hollywood is basing most or investing most in things that are recognizable brands, and serial killers and major crimes have become recognizable brands. That I think is like a culturally troublesome moment.
Yeah, I think that's a very incisive way to put it as well. Like the serial killer as a piece of intellectual property is like, yeah, I mean, I have me and my partner used to do a podcast. We don't really update it anymore, but we did an episode about like real life serial killer movies, like
Mm-hmm.
movies about real life serial killers. While it was in part while I was writing Penance, and I think it was sort of almost dubious research for that. And like some of these films are just like why do we have six Ted Bundy films? Like it is almost like this is like the latest entry in the Ted Bundy cinematic universe. Like
Yep.
this is what this Ted Bundy film is like, and it's so strange now that there's so much of it. Um,
Yeah, I mean, my theory is because we're still trying to grapple with the idea that two things can be true at once, that someone could be hot and with a very strong caveat, like hot in the 70s for some people, that someone could be traditionally attractive and also a, a depraved serial killer. Though those
yeah.
two things coexisting is still apparently enough to keep making movies about it.
Yeah, and it's so strange. I don't know. It has really become like an industry. I think that's also been an interesting thing to watch over the last kind of 10 years.
Mm.
Is it feels like this has gone from like a bit of a sort of weird niche interest to like a huge thing. It's kind of like the difference between like some of those like real life serial killer films you watch. Like most of them were like super crunchy indie films that
Yeah.
like would only be seen by people who were explicitly looking for material about those serial killers
Yeah, they were like a
in this day and
Henry
age.
portrait of a serial killer. They were grimy, and because they dealt
Yeah.
with grimy material and they
Uh,
were like
some
dark and demanding.
yeah, it's some of the stuff I saw. I'm like not even like on the level of competency of Henry, the portrait of a serial killer, like so like cheap and like rubbish, basically. But now it's like you kind of gone from like these kind of like strange little films that don't even have the budget for like period costuming to like
Yeah.
it's like a major Hollywood movie starring Zac Efron.
Yeah.
And it's so strange that that kind of cultural shift that it's taken as well. Like I'm not sure. It's almost like a bit sort of nostalgic. Like everything's going so terribly in the world that people are almost nostalgic for a time where like the main issue isn't climate change. It's like it's like, oh, what if I was like a guy that was killing people in my neighborhood?
Because you
Do you
could
know
get
what
rid of
I
the
mean?
guy. You could
Yeah,
get rid of the
exactly.
guy.
You can get rid of the guy. Like you can
Mhm.
deal with one guy in a much easier way than you can deal with like the collapse of the entire economy or a disease or
It's just much simpler for our minds to comprehend, right? We can wrap our
yeah.
minds around the idea of one person being bad. We kind of wrap our minds around the idea of everything that we've ever been told and the systems that govern our lives and that have governed our parents' lives, that will govern our children's lives, are fundamentally flawed in a way that is slowly or very quickly, in some cases, just killing us.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a cheerful note for us to
But
think about. But yeah, sorry,
but
go ahead.
going back to your book, it's been interesting hearing kind of your take on true crime as a whole, because one of the things that I've also kind of noticed about that genre, as it has mushroomed, and that I thought very interesting about Penance, is all of those, particularly the documentaries and the podcast, they very rarely focus on the victim, the
Mm,
person who actually dies, or the people who actually suffer, the people who are left behind, right?
mm,
They focus very much on the motivations, the upbringing, and kind of the reasons why someone might become a killer or might commit a murder. And there is this kind of idea that whoever the victim is, they must be perfect by a very strict definition. And
mm,
anything that kind of airs outside of that is then it's like, oh, well, what did they do? Where were they? Did they deserve it? It kind of starts creeping
mm.
into that territory of, well, they must have done something. And I found kind of Joni very interesting. I mean, all of the setting of the main crime of Penance, it's all teenage girls, which in itself is already compelling. But the fact that Joni, we really learn and change our perspective on her as the book progresses, I found particularly fascinating. And I wanted to ask you kind of about writing her specifically, because, what you kept
Mm.
in mind when you were creating someone who is very much not the perfect victim.
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking a lot about like just about the way teenagers behave,
Hmm.
where like you you kind of will very rarely get like there's no such thing as a teenager that's like a complete saint. And I think
Very
like
true.
even teenagers that are getting like picked on and regularly bullied will find opportunities to pick on other people.
Mhm.
So they can kind of have these moments of like either like asserting power or trying to kind of get like other people on their side, or trying to foster sort of connections between the people who are picking on them.
Hmm.
And I just think that it seems to be like such a fundamental part of the experience of being a teenager. Just seems to be like a lot of like working out where the boundaries of what's acceptable are, and kind of working out your own morality and how far you can push things, and like how you feel when you treat people a certain way. And it's kind of like you might be somebody who sort of does well socially and doesn't really think much about how they treat other people. Um, Sort of, I guess, other people kind of outside of your social circle or whatever, but you might think a lot about how you're treated within your social circle. Or you might be somebody who gets picked on all the time and is kind of almost at the bottom of the pile in terms of like how the social dynamics of your school are, but you also might take the opportunity to make a joke at the expense of like the kid that's even weirder than you,
Hmm.
because you know that you can do that and they'll get like a laugh out of other people. So I was thinking a lot about that, which is just like I feel like something I kind of became aware of while I was in high school.
Hmm.
Um, like there was a really odd girl in my year that was like super into horses and Kylie Minogue. And I like remember like making a joke at her expense because she sat
Hmm.
on the same table as me in art, and like everybody else laughing, and then kind of being like, oh well, that didn't feel good, did it?
Hmm.
That kind of felt like a bit like I'm sort of using my powers for evil here.
Hmm.
And yeah, I don't know, I and that moment kind of self-realization really stuck with me, of thinking like, oh, that was like a really shitty thing to do. Why did I do that? Like it was almost just like a pure kind of like, I don't know, like showing off moment. I wasn't really
Hmm.
thinking about her as like a person. I was thinking about like making other people laugh and etc. etc. So I think like that kind of like nasty streak that you can have, even if you think of yourself as like a nice person, is or like a good kid, I think is an interesting thing to explore. And I was also just thinking a lot about, I mentioned that book, The People Who Eat Darkness,
Hmm.
earlier. And one of the things it does so well in The People Who Eat Darkness is that I think you get like the kind of when the writer starts talking about the victim, who's called Lucy Blackman, he basically says that you can't, I'm not going to be able to sum her up because even though she was only kind of 20, she was already really, really complicated. And she was very contradictory, and there was a lot of other stuff going on for her. And she was already just like a very complex person.
Mm-hmm.
And as in the way that all people were complex. And I still felt like you did get like a very good sense of her as a person, like as somebody who is kind of like sort of really outgoing and friendly and like loved a good time, but who's also like super insecure and kind of like, well, just very, very insecure and very melancholic and almost a bit like, but yeah, just very insecure. And I think I really found that really, really interesting that he was sort of kind of covering as much about her that was positive as much as he was kind of talking about some of the bigger some of that quite big personality flaws basically. And I thought that was like it just made it like so impactful. um the more that you kind of knew about the crime, and obviously you kind of know that she's going missing, but it just makes it feel so much more like important and impactful that the story is being told. And I
Mm-hmm.
really kind of wanted to get over that sense of like a very of like a complete person, um or as like complete a person that you can sort of get across in a piece of fiction.
Mm. And conversely, the girls who are actually responsible for Joni's murder, they kind of get this similar treatment. None of them
Mm,
are portrayed as just sadistic or needlessly sadistic or just one-dimensional characters. There's so much time spent through different points of view, sometimes their own, of on kind of how they became that person and what
mm.
their individual relationship was with Joni, and sometimes how vitriolic it was.
Yeah, and I think again, I sort of was interested in kind of representing this sort of complete picture
Mhm.
of them, or like as complete a picture as I could try to draw. Um, I think particularly in these kind of like it, I think just teenagers are so weird and
They are.
so mad,
Hmm.
that I almost kind of want to get across this sense of like anybody could potentially end up in this place at that time in their life where I kind of do I feasibly think that every single teenager is capable of murder? No. Do I think every teenager could potentially get themselves into like a really strange friendship group where they start doing these things without really kind of thinking about the full impact and consequences? I read a book called Kamikaze Biker, which is by a sociologist whose name I can't remember. Wait a second. There we go. Um, I read a book called Kamikaze Biker by a sociologist called Ikuya Sato, who he
Hmm.
basically spent a lot of time with bike gangs in Tokyo. And he talks about this idea of corrupted play and like this idea of these teenage boys joining these bike gangs and like playing at the idea of being like a bad boy that's in a bike gang,
Yes.
and like sort of thinking like playing and role playing and sort of playing with friends and thinking like, oh, like we're the kind of guys who could rob someone at knife point. And then it's kind of like before you know it, you've robbed someone at knife point and you are just the kind of person that robs someone at knife point. Um, and I think I was really interested in that like sort of space of kind of play
Hmm.
and um almost kind of like role playing and thinking about stuff that you could do and then crossing that line and not being able to go kind of take it back, I think is so like interesting. And when I was kind of doing research about crimes involving children, I feel like
Hmm.
that's a really strong running theme. This idea of sort of playing at murder, and then before you know it, you have committed a murder.
Hmm.
Um, and I think yeah, I was just so interested in how much that feels like it could be possible for it could be it's almost like a potential path that a lot of people could potentially go down if in the right situation. So I suppose I kind of wanted to make a situation that felt very like this is kind of boiling up to something very dangerous. And I think sort of drawing portraits of these characters as people who would be particularly drawn in by
Mhm.
this sort of combination of elements and kind of fictions and interests and how far some of them would be willing to take it versus how far some of them would not be willing to take it. Yeah.
And you know that it really brings me into a question that I think is a bit too spoilerific for people who might not have read the book. So I'll keep that to the end. But before I get into that, what would you like readers to take away from the book?
Ooh, interesting. I suppose I would like people to come away maybe thinking a bit more about the way that they consume true crime. And I'm
Hmm.
not necessarily saying stop, just kind of having a bit more of a think about it. Because like I'm still reading true crime books and I'll probably dip in and out of a documentary here or there. But I sort of I guess I want people to think a little bit more about that consumption habit. And I think like one of the things that sort of is most troubling about true crime is the way that it like kind of it can give people like this very like weird carceral attitude, like this very like pro police, pro state violence, pro state, kind of like the state kind of completely overstepping the line in terms of like everybody's civil rights. And I would also like people to think about like how they view the police in the context of these crimes
Hmm.
rather than because I think so often the police are kind of framed as like the superhero and you get like the dogged FBI agent that solved the case or the detective that really kind of stuck his ground and stopped the murders. And it's like ultimately all of these crimes are the police's fault because they didn't stop them
Hmm.
before like and but then at the same time it's sort of like that thing of like that doesn't mean that we should all be like handing over our DNA and fingerprints and stuff so the police can like solve crimes more easily. um
Yeah, it's not
I
like a
don't know.
precog situation.
Yes, exactly, so we don't end up in God, what is that film
Minority
called?
Report.
Right, yeah, so we don't end up in like Minority Report, but I guess just to be very critical of the way
Hmm.
the police behave and the way that the state kind of interacts with your life and that like just because there is a crime to be solved doesn't mean that people don't still have rights. I don't know, that's a bit of a long kind of rambly thing to come out with, but I don't really talk about the police much in that book. I suppose that it's like I don't know, there sometimes people end up with
Hmm.
a very kind of almost like I don't know.
No, I think it makes sense. I think kind of, correct me if I'm misinterpreting you, but it sounds to me it's just like the structure of this book in particular and the question that I have for you about the ending, it kind of
Mm,
ties into some of the things you've just been saying. So,
mm,
throughout the entire book that it is a version of the story, as many as kind of the first person narratives you see in excerpts
mm,
from blogs and conversations and stuff. There, you're sometimes get to see the same, well, you get to see the same murder be interpreted by different formats and different kinds of people.
mm,
And the entire story is told through the point of view of a middle-aged male journalist, and it is a story about teenage girls,
mm,
so, and a very specific town. And you're never really or at least I never kind of found myself thinking, it's like, wait, as engrossed as I am in the narrative, I also am constantly reminded who the actual narrator is. So you
mm,
are sort of perched on the shoulders of a man, of a journalist with a particular set of intentions,
Mm,
who is, and you're viewing the story through his eyes. So you're kind of trying to piece together the story of what happened while trying to avoid being tarnished by Corelli's point of view.
mm. Yeah, yeah, and I guess yeah, that's sort of yeah, that's more or less what I'm saying is like I guess
Mm,
thinking about the point of view of who's kind of telling these stories and like what their political motivations are in telling the
mhm.
stories. So if you there's a lot of like true crime that comes from the perspective of the police. And
Yes.
it's kind of like you're not going to get them being like, oh yeah, and then we dicked about for 6 weeks and wasted loads
Mhm.
of money and like two more people got killed and it
Mhm.
was just sort of like but because we got those bodies, we were able to solve the crime, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Or all
Um
the political things that are at hand that they're never going to talk about because you just don't talk about those
yeah,
conflicts of interest.
yeah, I mean, there's stuff like in the like the Yorkshire Ripper case, which was like critically mismanaged. There was like a guy who lived in Sunderland who like was ringing up and claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. So they wasted loads of time, like just arresting random men in Sunderland and interviewing them, to see if he was West Side Jack, and they like wasted loads and loads of time and resources
Mhm.
on like I said, just kind of like interviewing random guys and arresting random men and putting like just random Macam man through this like awful interrogation process because a guy had rung up and said that he was the killer. And it's just sort of like this kind of thing where it's like there's always like so much incompetency and so much like stuff that has gone wrong in
Mhm.
the build up to terrible crimes like this. And I guess that's almost what I'm saying in a very, very roundabout way is that
Mm.
like none of these crimes happen because one evil guy has decided to go out and do something evil. It's always like this series of like failures that have
Mhm.
happened, which usually stem in some way from the state and are then exacerbated to an extent by policing itself. Um, yeah. So I guess that's
Mhm.
in a roundabout way what I would like people to take away from this is to think about the true crime that they consume and about how these narratives are being presented, and I guess what has actually happened on the way to this crime happening rather than just like one individual guy has gone mad.
Mhm. I have one question for you about the epilogue,
Mhm.
which will be spoilerific for readers. So if you don't want to hear it, please skip ahead. Buy Penance wherever you get your wherever you get your books. But I want to take the opportunity to ask you about the epilogue,
Mhm.
and it's structured as an interview with the author of the book within the book, and kind of puts into doubt the entire veracity of the story.
Mm.
And it is such a, I mean, I remember I was very specifically remember where I was when I read it because I only had the epilogue pages to go and I was trying to check in for a flight and I was just standing outside of the queue, kind of ushering people to go around me, trying to get to the end of the book. And it really pulled the rug out from under me with the whole thing. And I kept thinking about it on the
Mm.
plane because it kind of puts it kind of makes you doubt everything you've just read, the
Mm.
400 pages you've spent with these characters and getting to know them, and the as much as you, like I was saying before, try to keep in mind that this is the point of view of another character. It's not
Mm.
just an omniscient narrator. It Because he's sort of outed as being this very biased hack journalist who had possibly, manufactured elements or definitely
Mm.
put himself perhaps too much into the story. Um, I wanted to ask you about the decision to include that and where that leaves us as readers. Do we believe everything that's happened up until that point, or is that another kind of way for you to remind us to analyze and keep in mind the point of view that's telling the story?
Yeah, I think once I'd kind of done that reading about like Truman Capote, I think
Mhm.
I really wanted to like hammer home the idea that like these nonfiction books are just like they're just you're just dependent on one narrator and his point of view, usually his, sometimes her, but often his.
Mhm.
Um, kind of his point of view and what he thinks is relevant to tell you, and sort of like his almost like strange fixations and like what he's interested in, um and what he's prepared to do and kind of like who he's prepared to exploit and what he's going to put in and what he's going to leave out. So I mentioned that I read Gordon Burns' Happy Like Murderers
Mhm.
earlier on, which is a very, very sort of interesting text for how unpalatable it is in places where Gordon Byrne has kind of, it's a book about Fred and Rose West, and it's almost written in like Fred West's headspace. And
Mm.
Fred West was obviously a sick sex freak, pervert, murderer guy. So the prose of the book is really difficult to read at some points because he's just going into these like really, really like explicit, gross sexual tirades where it's kind of like done to the point to sort of almost make you feel like you are in that Fred West headspace, but it also really like you do really question the value of doing that and like what kind of the point of highlighting this point of view. And even though it's sort of like this really, really interesting experiment in like how far you can kind of push this type of writing, it does also leave you thinking like it like just with this really like ugh, like why are you doing this kind of feeling. And it's sort of like he's doing it to make you think, why are you doing this? And why am I reading this and why am I engaging with this at all? But it's also, it's just kind of like the extent to which how much does that land, and it's almost like a bit of a gaze thing, I think,
Mhm.
of when we think about sort of male gaze in film and stuff, of how like it's almost like inescapable, this sort of sense of like men's point of view and their sexual interests and their sort of psychosexual fixations and stuff. And I think I like basically, I think like sometimes when I read sort of true crime books, even if they are very good, sometimes they'll contain like odd little details where I'll kind of think like, why are you telling me that?
Mhm.
Why have you gone into this much detail? I'm at the minute I'm reading Francisco Garcia's We All Go Into the Dark, which is about the hunt for Bible John, the sort of unsolved case of the possibly real, possibly made up serial killer Bible John in Glasgow.
Mhm.
And he talks about some of the books that he read and the way that the books will go into these like long flights of fantasy about like the victims like final nights as they go to the Barrowland ballroom and then get picked up by Bible John, and how they like sort of build on and kind of build this fiction of like the victim like going in and like going to the bathroom to powder her nose and like buying a
Mhm.
drink and bumping it's this sort of strange thing of like, I don't know. I guess I kind of wanted people to think about who why people are telling these stories and who has the right to tell them, and
Mhm.
who has the right to like extrapolate and fictionalize and make these kind of like assumptions and make up, basically to make up these stories about real people who've been killed in horrible circumstances
Mhm.
and people who have killed other people in horrible circumstances. So it was I guess I like I just, yeah, the it was important for me to people to come away and then immediately question everything that they just read, because I
Mhm.
sort of feel like that is maybe how everybody should come away from every piece of nonfiction, particularly true crime nonfiction.
I love it, Eliza. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
all your candor and the weird little nuggets of research that you shared. I would just wanted to end by asking you about your next book,
Mhm.
your collection of horror short stories, She's Always Hungry.
Yes.
When can we expect that? Because I'm dying to read it.
I believe it's late 2024. I'll say it's not quite all horror, but it's mostly I think it's like it's mostly speculative
Hmm.
and most of the speculative stuff is horror but there's a couple of like kind of not spooky ones in there, but
Hmm.
it's mostly spooky. It's mostly spooky. And that will be out in like yeah, I think late 24. It was
Hmm.
originally going to be spring 24, but I think we moved it a bit so it wasn't sort of like Penance hardback, Penance paperback. She's always hungry paperback, and then
Hmm.
it's just kind of like being this spam from me for 2 years. But yes, late 2024. You should see that.
Amazing. I mean, I'm happy for you to spam bookshops. Very happy for there to be more Eliza Clark stuff on the shelves. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been such a joy.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you. The victim like going in and like going to the bathroom to powder our nose and like buying a
Hmm.
drink and bumping it's this sort of strange thing of like I don't know. I guess I kind of wanted people to think about why people are telling these stories and who has the right to tell them and
Hmm.
who has the right to like extrapolate and fictionalize and make these kind of like assumptions and make up basically to make up these stories about real people who've been killed in horrible circumstances
Hmm.
and people who have killed other people in horrible circumstances. So it was I guess I just yeah, the it was important for me to people to come away and then immediately question everything that they just read because I
Hmm.
sort of feel like that is maybe how everybody should come away from every piece of nonfiction, particularly true crime nonfiction.
I love it, Eliza. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
all your candor and the weird little nuggets of research that you shared. I would just wanted to end by asking you about your next book,
Mhm.
your collection of horror short stories, She's Always Hungry.
Yes.
When can we expect that? Because I'm dying to read it.
I believe it's late 2024. I'll say it's not quite all horror, but it's mostly I think it's like it's mostly speculative
Hmm.
and most of the speculative stuff is horror but there's a couple of like kind of not spooky ones in there, but
Hmm.
it's mostly spooky. It's mostly spooky. And that will be out in like yeah, I think late 24. It was
Hmm.
originally going to be spring 24, but I think we moved it a bit so it wasn't sort of like Penance hardback, Penance paperback. She's always hungry paperback, and
Hmm.
then it's just kind of like being this spam from me for 2 years. But yes, late 2024. You should see that.
Amazing. I mean, I'm happy for you to spam bookshops. Very happy for there to be more Eliza Clark stuff on the shelves. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been such a joy.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.